Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second virtual career week of the academic year. My name is Cheryl Finley, and I'm the director of the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective. I'm joined here by our amazing team, Rachel Brown and Lauren Jackson Harris. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce George Wells, who's going to be leading our first session today and sharing with us his own career insights. And I think one of the things that we'd like to highlight, of course, is some of the work he's been doing recently, and especially the noted December 2020 headline, wherein George Wells made the announcement that of a pledge of roughly $1 million worth of art works that will be forming Morehouse College's first permanent art collection. So this is a forthcoming promised gift that we're all really excited about, and something that has really kind of done a lot of moving and shaking around the conversations that we have at the Atlanta University Center around art, but also around art and technology, and also the way that alumni especially are making waves within the contemporary art industry. The donation, which consists of works by LGBTQ and/or Black artists who focus on identity and race, such as Mickalene Thomas, Rashid Johnson, Amy Sherald, MacArthur Bingen, and Ivy Hadelman, represents the formation of a priceless cultural and artistic legacy on the campus. So we're really excited about this. And George, I also wanted to say to you that one of our students who's a Morehouse student is actually thinking about designing his curatorial practicum capstone exhibition based on this amazing gift that you have bestowed upon us. So we're really excited about your donation, but also just the way that you have already been a beacon for our students in the program. For everyone here, for those of you who don't know that much about George Wells, I'd like to share with you that he is the chairman of the Wells Group of New York, which is a 13-person management consulting firm based in New York City that specializes in working with high-growth businesses in the consumer, internet, healthcare, technology, and contemporary art spaces. And he's also the CFO of Quip, an oral care startup. Mr. Wells also serves as interim CFO of Maisonette, a children's luxury goods marketplace and business manager to contemporary artist Mickalene Thomas. His previous executive roles include serving as the interim CFO of Draper James, a lifestyle clothing brand founded by Reese Witherspoon, and interim COO CFO of Lehmann Maupin, one of the top 10 galleries in the world. Through October 2017, George served as the CFO of Zola, the fastest growing wedding registry and wedding company in the country. As a member of Zola's 8-person executive team, George was responsible for designing and implementing the finance, accounting, legal, and HR administrative functions as the first finance executive hire. During his time at Zola, revenue grew from a single-digit millions to hundreds of millions in a 2-year time frame. And I'm mentioning all of George's accomplishments because we are here in a virtual career week setting. This is something that we want all of our students, everyone who is here with us today, to really absorb, to really think about how you can go from an undergraduate career at Morehouse College or at Clark Atlanta University or at Spelman College, and to go on to do the kinds of things that George Wells has done. I want to say one of the things that, he is, I would call a serial entrepreneur. Prior to founding his consulting firm and a bit by his father's own entrepreneurial legacy, Mr. Wells was vice president of Lieberfarb and Associates, an incubator and investment firm started by Warren Lieberfarb. Lieberfarb is known in Hollywood as the father of the DVD due to his work evangelizing the format as the president of Warner Home Video for 20 years. And in terms of the work that George did to kind of get him to the point where he is in his career, he began in 1999 as a financial analyst at Morgan Stanley's Mergers and Acquisitions Group. He also held roles in private equity as an analyst at Goldman Sachs, PIA Group, and as an associate at Houlihan Lokey's Financial Restructuring Group. Mr. Wells serves on the Out in Tech board, an organization committed to promoting diversity in the tech and startup community, and has pledged $1 million worth of art in his donation that we mentioned earlier to Morehouse College. Mr. Wells was born in New England, in Newport, Rhode Island. And he received his bachelor's degree in finance and accounting from Morehouse College and his MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business. And so his husband, Manfred, together they maintain residences in New York, Los Angeles, and Tyrol, Austria. So without further ado, George, I would like to welcome you to the floor and just thank you so much again for sharing with us today. We're really, really delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, and thank you for the recap. It's so funny when you were talking about all the stuff I've done, it actually made me realize I am in my mid 40s because it's quite a lot when sort of presented in totality like that. So thank you so much for the kind
work.
You're
welcome. I didn't mention your name. I didn't mention when you graduated, but I just wanted to share with everyone because it takes time and it's not just the undergraduate degree, but that's the springboard. That's the starting point. And I think that you have so many really important accomplishments that I would like for everyone to know about them and for us to learn from your experience. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Emma from my team to go into present mode and present a presentation that we prepared to discuss the topics that you guys suggested for this format. I will try to, we just did the intro. I'll do the presentation for 35 minutes and then we will do Q&A for the remainder of the time. Emma and I really thought that putting some of my favorite works up on the screen and infusing art throughout it made sense. And I also added a slide that just shows the art ecosystem so that we can maybe talk about the different places that are directly relevant to the art students. So that's the only slight variation to your suggested talking points. But as you mentioned, I went to Stanford Business School. Always really wanted to be an entrepreneur. My dad was a car financier and real estate investor. And, I started working with him at a very, very young age. I would say from age 13, working with him on bookkeeping and analysis and thinking about growth. So I was very lucky in that regard. Most of my career, as you mentioned, has been centered around innovation. And that really started when I went to Lieber Farben Associates as a vice president in 2008. It was at Lieber Farben Associates where we developed a content delivery network that was intended to compete with the Apple ecosystem. But unlike Apple, it had copyright protection technology that would allow not just one device manufacturer to make the product, so that you could have a Samsung player with a Sony disc. It was to open it up, and we incubated the idea and then sold it to Warner Brothers for $25 million. And that, once we sold it, became the time that I set up my firm, Wells Group in New York. And the firm's real mandate was to help as many startup entrepreneurs realize their dreams. So many people have a very good idea. So many people have a very good business plan, but very few early in a company's life can help think about long-term, strategic finance issues, like how much money do you raise? Make sure you don't raise enough. Make sure that you set up the accounting infrastructure earlier on and things like that. And so while the idea was born out of my time at Stanford, it really took hold after Lieber Farben Associates. Next slide. So this slide is interesting because it kind of goes through the timeline, but I started at Morehouse in 1996 as part of the class of 2000, which is super interesting because sometimes I think of myself as somewhat of a millennial, but I think I'm maybe a couple years older than the average. But I think the fact that I graduated college in 2000 with a degree, with a business degree with concentrations in finance and accounting, is kind of symbolic of the futuristic approach I try to take to my career. I very much don't let existing standards stop my dreaming and stop my execution, if you will. And that really started at Morehouse, where in 1997, at age 19, I interned at Salomon Brothers in investment banking. At the time, they were only looking for seniors, but I was able to convince them through both interviewing and the knowledge that I had gained that first year at Morehouse to give me an internship a couple years early. And so I interned on Wall Street every summer while at Morehouse. And then I went into M&A at Morgan Stanley, which is a highly sought after investment banking group. It's probably the most sought after. It took a lot of work and determination and chutzpah to secure that. But following that time at Morgan Stanley, where I helped Fortune 500, Fortune 100, large multinational billion-dollar enterprises acquire or sell their businesses. And I think that high-level position to start one's career really helped me with the foundation to then go on to Goldman and other things and really ultimately build the firm. And so my suggestion for students on that level, because I know there's probably not a ton of would-be investment bankers on this call, is to focus on building your pedigree and your personal brand from the beginning. And so much of that is through the first job that you take out of college. In so many ways, the first job out of college can dictate the rest of your career if done in a very strategic way. And so, having done investment banking for 4 or 5 years before going to business school, I say 4 or 5 years because including internships, I did 3 internships. So I like to say 5 years, but it was split up the first year. But in 2004 to 2006, I wanted to go to business school. I decided on Stanford because I really wanted to do something entrepreneurial, and I really just wanted to go to the best school that I could get in. My dad helped with Morehouse, but he gave limited help for business school. But I still, despite having to take on some loans, really wanted to just go to the best school I got into, and luckily that was my number one choice, Stanford. After Stanford, like so many other recent graduates, you start to think, okay, how can I make the most money possible? That's how I thought when I graduated. And then I looked at a list, and then I said, of those jobs, what job would I really want and what increases my skill set? And so I decided to go to Houlihan Lokey because I didn't know much about companies. I knew companies when they were doing very well and were acquiring or selling. I didn't know much about distressed companies and companies that are going through bankruptcy. And I didn't understand much about the balance sheet. So, I really thought a job at Houlihan Lokey would round out my skill set. And I thought at the time that I had conquered private equity and M&A. I later learned that I didn't know everything about private equity and M&A, but at the time I thought I knew everything. And so this was a skill set that helped and helps me today, kind of that round, the combination of Goldman, Morgan Stanley, and Houlihan experience, because they're very different, helps me and informs the work I do every day at Quip and as the founder of Wells Group in New York. After one bonus cycle at Houlihan, I decided to go to Lieber Farben Associates. While I was at Stanford in 2005, I actually interned for Lieber Farben Associates, so I knew them and had been in long-standing talks with Warren about coming back to the firm. I kind of had to prove out my value to him in terms of the salary that I wanted. So that's why I took the job at Houlihan. And finally, in 2008, we were able to agree on a compensation package that I thought was fair for my skills. And so then I joined in 2008, and then 2 years, we did the sprint towards building out this content delivery network that was ultimately acquired by Warner Brothers. And it was after that time, Warren was about 70 years old and sort of slowing his career. And his wife was very much pushing for him to slow down. So he just needed me part-time. So then I looked at that as an opportunity instead of, oh, my boss wants me to look at this part-time, I better find a new job. I thought, well, maybe now is the time that I can start my consulting firm, and Lieber Farben and Associates served as the anchor client. So I did that for about 5 years, and ultimately had built out, I would say by 2015, an infrastructure that allowed me to, be involved with the firm that I built. But I started hiring and building out the team so that I could take on full-time jobs while I still had the firm. And Zola was really the first one that really did that. Zola is a venture capital backed company. It started as a wedding registry, but now it's like all wedding services. And I was the first finance hire, and I built out the entire financial infrastructure, the forecasting, the financial modeling. I ran legal, I ran HR at the time because I had to wear many hats because at startups you have to wear many hats. and really did a hardcore sprint for about 2.5 years to build out the infrastructure, which really, really was exemplified by seeing the company's valuation increase 10x over those 2 years. But I view myself as somewhat of a fixer and someone that likes to like fix complex problems and move on. So I decided to do that and go to Lehmann Maupin. I had heard about, I didn't really know Lehmann Maupin that well, but I had heard about the daughter of one of the founders, a woman named Laura Lehmann, who I had worked with the family on technology investments. And I started to get to know the art world through my conversations with her, but I never really thought that that was a world that I would tap into. And then one day, seemingly randomly, she asked me, she and her father, who I knew, asked me if I would be interested in running Lehmann Maupin. They were at a very interesting time. Lehmann Maupin, I think, is one of the best, I would say, top 3 programs. They are a art gallery with offices and spaces in London, two in New York, one in Hong Kong, one in Seoul, and they had opened their flagship in New York, or were planning to open their flagship in New York about 8 months after I joined. So they really needed help, I would say, like transformational help on messaging. So at the time, I actually ran, I would say, most of the business side of the gallery, including communications. And so much of the Lehmann Maupin experience informs what I'm doing and how I came about the gift and what artists are in the gift and also in my collection, because it's a very small part of my collection that is part of the Morehouse gift that you mentioned. So, you know, and now I'm an art collector. And of course, as you mentioned, I'm a business advisor to Mickalene Thomas, but I'm not as actively involved in the art world. But I think that story is very much unwritten. And then you see logos on the other side that kind of talk about Morehouse, the different components of my success, which I think Morehouse, in the way that Morehouse opened up the world to me as kind of like a relatively small town guy that grew up in Newport, Rhode Island and St. Augustine, Florida. I didn't know what New York was. I mean, I knew what New York was. I didn't know what investment banking was and what it meant. And, you know, I didn't know that, you know, the most prestigious firms in the world recruit at Morehouse. I had a sense that prestigious firms did, but I didn't know like the relative importance of, say, Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs. It all seemed like just a job or a corporate job until I dug in a little bit deeper. Okay, next slide, Ems. So I think what's interesting about the art world is that there is such a focus and on Black art, and that's a relatively new phenomenon. So many artists like Mickalene, who I pulled some of these stats from a Sotheby's article that came out about 2 years ago that I really liked, and I also liked that they used the image of Mickalene. So I asked Emma, my chief of staff, to include that image. But what's interesting is that since 2008, only 2.3% of museum acquisitions are from the top 30 institutions are of Black artists. So there's still a lot of work to go. It used to be 0% or 0.1%, but it's relatively, there's still a lot of white space in opportunity, pardon the pun. They've only programmed or had exhibitions for 7.6% of African American artists. And as we all know, Blacks we constitute 13% of the population. So there's still a lot of work to go. But then when you remove Studio Museum in Harlem, which of course is one of the most 30 prominent institutions, then you're talking 2.7% of exhibitions of Black artists. You know, so there's still a lot of room to grow. But I think what's happened with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that there's a lot more attention on it. And I think that the art ecosystem very much needs your students to get involved at the ground level, doing the work at not just museums, but also galleries, becoming art writers. Becoming art collectors who also oftentimes have the ultimate say, and becoming curators at museums. There's a lot of different opportunities. And I think that the last stat captures that. Only 16% of all leadership positions at art museums are held by people of color, and only 4% of museum curators are African American. So tons of opportunity, and I love the work that you guys are doing at the AUC Art Collective and Spelman and Morehouse and CAU to do the work to increase those numbers. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I think what's so interesting about my art collection is that I got very lucky, right? I worked at Lehmann Maupin, who at the time represented Mickalene Thomas. And it's really Mickalene Thomas's work that opened my eyes to the art world. You kind of need that first moment where you're like, oh, art is interesting, or art is directly relevant to me. At least I needed that given my relatively vocational college experience. I was very hardcore about getting into investment banking. I actually hated the liberal arts parts of the college, even though I had to study them. And so I kind of glossed over, I guess, the left side of the brain. And it's really a chance encounter with the Mickalene Thomas painting wall at Lehmann Maupin, and the fact that Lehmann Maupin is such a top gallery with great artists, which include Mickalene, MacArthur Binion, Nari Ward. They previously represented Tracy Emin. They represent Doho Suh, Gilbert and George. Really, really profound artists that I was awakened to this opportunity. My firm, Wells Group in New York, we do finance and accounting strategy for mostly startups, but we also work with companies and entrepreneurs across all spaces. I think in so many ways, an artist is an entrepreneur. I know it's very forbidden to say such a thing, but at the end of the day, if you're an artist that needs to pay bills, you're ultimately running a business. Obviously, it's a very academic and creative business, and it's sort of, for lack of a word, kind of like a very highfalutin world, and you can't call it a business. But I think those that approach their practices as a brand are more successful, and those who pick the right partners, whether that's galleries or museums or artists that you trade ideas with, those who think long-term about those aspects of their oeuvre, I think tend to do a lot better. Let's see, other key.
George, could I just, if you don't mind me interrupting just for a second,
Yes.
I just wanted to underscore the point that you just made, because our program is one that, we are working with students who are curatorial studies minors and art history majors. We are in a department of art and visual culture at Spelman College. And we are not only working with students who might be organizing exhibitions or writing about art, but rather students who are making art. And I think it's important for everyone to know about this idea of branding and how important it is to think about, if you are an artist, for example, a practicing artist, to really come out of the gates thinking about what you're doing as a business. It doesn't make it less artful. It doesn't make it less creative or less appealing to collectors. It's really important to, have these financial wits about us at a very, very young age. And I just want to thank you for sharing that with the work that you do.
Thank you. I think that's a really great point. I think it's very important. I mean, you want to, most artists that I've worked with, and I've had the pleasure of working with so many, most artists want to have the freedom to make the work that speaks to them, that's born out of their ideas. And to do that, you really need capital and you need backing. And so you have to, I would steer away from, and you're not saying this, a purely commercial lens, but you want to make sure that you're building a viable practice that will last for generations. And to do that, I think, to your point, you have to have like a business lens. We collected so far about 52 works now. It really runs the full gamut. Mickalene and Rashid Johnson are the biggest. I think I have like 5 Rashids and maybe, I don't know, 11 Mickalene Thomas works. But this Mickalene Thomas is my favorite work in my entire collection. And it is from 2004, soon after Yale. And it's from Mickalene's She's Gotta Have It series. And it really is amazing. And I think it's like the breakout body of work that really put her on the map that ultimately led her to discovering Lehmann Maupin and Kavi Gupta and some of the other galleries that she's worked with. And it is very, very well executed, which you can imagine a rhinestone heavy painting being very difficult to make with limited resources. And she did have limited resources at that time. But I love this work. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Ems. So for the Morehouse collection, it took a long time for me to realize, what I would call my destiny in terms of the Morehouse gift. It is something that's affected my life in so many ways, and my life has changed since the pledge and since working with Dr. Thomas in the Morehouse community on the gift. And really, my dad passed about 10 years ago, and my husband and I, we're not having kids. So it became, well, why am I working this hard? Why do I have 2 jobs? Why? This doesn't make sense. And then I realized that I am a bit of a workaholic, so I needed to find a new source of motivation. And it really became collecting, but collecting for the sake of collecting is great, but I wanted to add some purpose to it. And so by giving a small part of my collection to Morehouse today and pledging that today gives me more a sense of drive and purpose. And to be honest, it also helps with my own stature in the art world. So it's kind of part of just being transparent, my own brand building, because being a patron of the arts is an honor. It's an honor to be able to buy a painting for $300,000 and gift it to a college. I mean, it's what a privileged perspective, but it is something that is passionate to me and has changed my outlook on life in so many ways. I was very excited when Morehouse and my PR company secured the CNN article to announce it. And so we really did all that work in December of 2020. But in February of the same year, before the pandemic, here I am with the president of the college and the chairman of the board. I was inducted as a trustee society member for giving or pledging more than 100,000, and that excludes my gift. I was already being philanthropic with Morehouse, but the gift took it to the next level. Okay, Emma, we can go to the next one. So the art world is super interesting. It is so multifaceted. It's about $60 billion in size globally. Now that sounds like a lot, but it is a lot. 60 billion is a lot of money, but that's small in a global sense. About a third of that is in the US. And so it's kind of about, in the US, it's like about the same size as a wedding registry business, right? So like that gives you a sense of how that it's relatively small and there's few players that truly matter. The players are auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's and Phillips. And so auction houses are almost, you can think of as a clearinghouse for art. It's kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of an artist's value. It doesn't define an artist's value, but it definitely is the last peg of kind of cementing an artist's career. Now, working with Lehmann Maupin was super interesting because working with Lehmann Maupin, we only worked with living artists, right? And that's important, and that determines their primary prices. That's their primary prices. The auction is their secondary market prices, and that's like if you go. Many people know car auctions, and my dad owned car dealerships, so at a car auction, you go to an auction. 20 seconds, the car goes through, the car is bought. It's very similar in the art world. Okay, so that's auction houses. Artists and artist estates. I think the greatest work and what I liked most about my time at Lehmann Maupin was working with artists and artist estates. Just because, and in many ways, to be a good artist, you have to have your own unique lens into the world, and you have to see the world with a unique perspective and have something fresh to say. And as I mentioned, as a finance and accounting major, I never dreamed that I would work with people who I think are documenting the human experience in such a fascinating way. So it's almost like they're creative geniuses, and they are creative geniuses in being able to work with an artist studio. There's a lot of jobs. There's studio manager. You can be an assistant in an art studio, and that kind of experience is paramount, right? Because without making the art, no one else can do any of the other work, right? Um, Secondary market is very linked to auction houses. I talked about that already. Collectors, as a student, it took me getting to, in my 40s to afford art, so we'll skip over collectors, but collectors are a vital part of the art ecosystem because they are the patrons, they are donating to the museums, and they are helping artists, living artists with their livelihood, right, and supporting them. And so when I collect, I like to collect with a very long-term approach. I like to collect multiple works by an artist, and I like to watch their career. I've never bought and sold an artwork of a living artist, and I don't know that I ever will, just because you're along for the ride and you're in partnership with them, and presumably the best is yet to come. And so I definitely take that approach of a long-term hold. Art fairs are really exciting. They're in some ways galleries answer to auction houses, right? Because auction houses have the hype machine of an auction running, say, tomorrow, and there's 100 works, and it's very transactional, right? And art fairs kind of have a similar effect, right? Because there's hundreds of galleries are exhibiting in convention centers, and the once the fair opens, it's like in the first hour that the most desirable works are sold. And so it kind of it's a very exciting way to discover new artists. That's certainly how I've discovered artists outside of Lehmann Maupin's programs, including artists like Rasheed Johnson, who I came to know from seeing his work in an art fair. Curators and academics, honestly, I think curators are second to the artist, the most important part of the ecosystem, because if artists are reflecting the times in which we live, right, curators are helping curate the story, right, and put together exhibitions at institutions. And it's every artist's dream to be a part of art history. It's very hard to be a part of art history without the respect and influence of curators and academics. And so that is, curators and academics are almost like the anthropologists of the art world, and a very important figure. And then there's dealers, which are Lehmann Maupin and art dealers. Generally, art galleries don't like being called art dealers, so never say that. But that's essentially what they are. They're making markets for these artists. And look, I think millennials are the most active growing set. I think things like NFTs kind of open up the floor to reconcepting what constitutes art. I personally won't be buying NFTs, but I think that that's probably something I'll miss out on and then be sad that I hadn't. And female collectors actually have a higher average level of spending than men. I find that females tend to do more research and do more work, and so I'm not surprised to see that. I know that's a broad generality. And then auction sales constitute 42% of the market. So there's many places to play. It's a relatively big, but actually small in comparison industry. And starting one's career, I think an auction house, a museum, and a gallery, and an artist studio are the four places to start. I think it's better to get one of the auction house or gallery jobs first, so that you have perspective when working at an artist studio, because oftentimes at an artist studio, you're only working with 4 or 5 people at max, and you kind of want to have the general perspective of your role in the art market before going to such a micro level and focus role. Okay, next slide, Emma. So here's a couple of pieces of works that I have. Rashid and Mickalene are being donated to the collection. Those are two artists that are being donated to the collection. I think one thing that people don't realize about Mickalene specifically is that she has paintings, which I showed you my favorite painting of hers earlier, my favorite painting in my collection. And now I also own a lot of collage and photography, which I think is more accessible and very interesting. And really, it's all mediums that really Mickalene's able to put her stamp on all of her mediums, which I think for your visual artist studios, students, that's very unique. Most people are known for one thing, but she's renowned across mediums, which I think is really interesting. And then the picture in there was in Paris at her exhibition at Gallery Natalie Obadia, sorry, the Jet Butte de Moi series, where she unveiled paintings that were informed during conversation with the Jet Monthly. So Jet actually had a publication that was competitive with Playboy, which I didn't know. And Mickalene collaged out images and then painted those collages, and so she's done like collage and photography of that body of work, and she continues to work on that body of work, which is super exciting. But I love that she has things, things priced for everyone. And then on the right side, there's two artists that are depicted. The Lauren Halsey you can't see, but it's from her engravings, and it's carved on gypsum wood. So you can't see the detail in this shoot, but what I like about that work is that you can see the words Black owned beauty supply. And a lot of Lauren Halsey's work is about racial identity, displacement from gentrification, and it takes almost archaeological approach to it. And so her work is really interesting. If you don't know it, you should. And then Tyler Mitchell, there's a Tyler Mitchell image on the right, which I think is one of his most popular images. It actually was taken in the UK, which is kind of surprising. And I just remember doing conference calls. Those works are at my place in LA. And I remember doing conference calls, and most of the people that I interact with are white, and like behind me that they could see that image. And I never actually said anything about it or explained it, but I could see how shocked they were by it. Because like seeing it's actually 5 Black men shirtless in a field evokes such a strong reaction. But I think what's interesting about Tyler's work is that he's trying to capture Black people living everyday happy lives, right? And that alone is sort of like cutting edge, if you will. The photo wasn't taken by Tyler, but the photograph on the right is Tyler's work. And Emma, we can go to the next slide. So here's more images. I asked Emma to put some images of like more of the art, and most of it's around from press. But I think what's super interesting about the image on the left, we took that in connection with the Cultured magazine article that came out a couple months ago. But you have MacArthur Binion, who was a relatively unknown, undiscovered artist up until recently. He had some success in the 70s, but then kind of went quietly and did his work. He was lucky that he could live off of the art, and his art was so interesting and commanding, but it didn't have true commercial and curatorial success until he was featured in the 2017 Biennale. And that's when, soon after that, Lehmann Maupin picked him up. And that's when around the same time that I joined the gallery. And then there's actually a Tyler Mitchell photograph that I'm standing in front of, but I wish I wasn't, because it's a great image. It's called Two Girls Embrace. And then I think that one of the most interesting, or sort of like avant-garde works and socio-political works, is the work at the end of the hallway, which is a work named Rocco Number 2 by Kathy Opie. Kathy Opie is a South Los Angeles-based queer artist whose work is all informed by depicting marginalized communities in interesting almost old masters infused photography. And so this is Rocco number 2 is actually a woman, a trans man. So a man who was born a woman, excuse me. And I actually didn't realize it until after I bought it, but I just think it's so amazing and it's such a great work. And just thinking about my own experience at Morehouse, I never hooked up with a man, or I wasn't very comfortable with my homosexuality at Morehouse at all, actually. And then, so that's why so much of my works in my collection are Black and gay, because obviously I'm quite comfortable with it at this point. The work on the middle is a work by Hernan Boz, a Cuban-born artist that lives between Detroit and Miami. He's one of the most amazing painters. He is oftentimes placing young men in paranormal environments, and that painting that's me and Manfred are sitting in front of is no different, and I think one of his best paintings, actually. And then on the right is from Rashid Johnson's Anxious Man series. This work is not going to the college, but actually none of these works are going to the college. But what's interesting about Rashid is that he's very much known for the Anxious Man series. And historically, it was using Black paint. And due to COVID and the election and all living in isolation, he changed the colors of the paint to red. And it was meant to be symbolic of all the angst that those of us who are on the left felt over the course of the last year. And it's not just about his own Black experience, but it's about our own collective experience. And so I thought I'd include that because I love it. Okay, Emma, next slide. So this Amy Sherald on the left is going to the college and is one of my favorite works. It's called Handsome. It's actually a print, but it's a very well executed print where they recreated the painting using ink. It's pretty fascinating. I'm in Florida right now, and I've only seen it once. I unpacked it before I left Bridgehampton and just stared at it all night before flying out the next day. But it's very exciting, and I'm sure we'll all see a lot of that image because every exhibition that we have at the college will probably include that and the Rashid Johnson painting that was earlier seen. And then you can see here in the middle the Black Anxious Man and then the red Anxious Man. I love Rashid's work. And a collage by Mickalene. You get kind of a side view of a collage of a Maya 2004 photo shoot. Maya is one of Mickalene's foremost muses, after both her mother and Raquel, her current partner. And then there's Charles Gaines, who uses numbers and colors and systems and I love numbers and colors, and I love his work very much. I think Emma, is this the last slide or is there one more? I think that's the last slide.
Yes, that's it.
Okay, so I'll stop there for questions. Thank you for the time check, Cheryl.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much, George. That was fascinating. It was great. So good to see. Oh, good. And Christian's here. Yay. So if you don't mind, George, I'm actually going to call on, do you want me to read your questions or calling you, Christian?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
If it's open for questions, I have a few, as you know. I can go ahead, Dr. Finley.
Yes, please.
So hi, my name is Christian Bryan. I'm a senior art history major at Morehouse College, currently in Atlanta, Georgia, but I'm originally from Washington, D.C. And I think my project was talked about a little bit beforehand, but one of my biggest questions that I have for you was, what advice do you have for Morehouse in terms of building an art collection? And like, what do you think are the major components that Morehouse needs to kind of stick to in order to kind of be an institution that collects and exhibits artwork?
That is a great question. I think couple things. I think as I think about gifting to Morehouse, I am very much curating the works that are starting the college's permanent collection, because it's something that's relatively new. So I think there's a lot of white space. I think the college, in partnership with me, we're all trying to do work. How should it be structured? What is the programming? I think the number one goal is for us to make the art world more inclusive, right? And so doing programming and having exhibitions and even participating in talks like this to actually activate the gift and become a mentor to students like you. And I think that's what it's really all about. It's about learning and talking and influencing more and Morehouse and Spelman NCAU students and Black students to get into those jobs at auction houses, to get into those jobs at galleries, to maybe become the next Mickalene Thomas. But to do that, we just have to every year have programming. And from my perspective, they don't have to do so much around thinking about what to include, because for me, I'm just going to give them what I think they should have, if that makes sense. But I think a lot of it is around programming. And even though it's a promise gift and I don't have to give the works until, it's in my will and stuff, we'll probably start to do programming as early as this fall to really activate it and get the community talking.
That's really great, George. I hope you don't mind me just jumping in again here. And I think at some point, Christian, you should share your ideas with Mr. Wells for your exhibition, because it's for him, that's kind of the cornerstone for this proposed exhibition that he's planning, as a way, I think, in the same way that you're thinking, George, about not just activating the promise gift, but also enabling that promise gift to bring more attention to the college, but also more potential donors like yourself to the college, whether they be bequeathing works of art, or also other kinds of material or financial gifts to the college. So I'm looking forward to the two of you continuing the conversation. I know that Ming Washington had her hand raised for a question.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I've really enjoyed this talk, and I'm curious, as a relatively new patron and collector, are you working with a team to manage your collection, as well as with your work spread across many properties? Are you rotating the work in those spaces?
So good questions. As it relates to, do I work with someone on the collection and maintaining it? I do most of it myself. I'm very lucky to have this creative outlet, and it's something that I hold on to very tightly. So I do all my own research. I don't work with art advisors. On conservation, I have some people that I know from Lehmann Maupin, and on shipping, I kind of made a lot of those more functional connections while they're at the gallery. And of course, I work with Mickalene Thomas Studio, and to be honest, I think Mickalene Thomas is the greatest artist of all time. And so I have access through those means as well. But I think as the collection continues to get bigger and evolve, I think there's probably going to become a need to have at least some support. And then, sorry, I forget your second question. Can you repeat it?
Sure. My second question is, with your work exhibited on many properties or in many spaces, are you rotating?
Oh, so that's a great question. We don't rotate too much. When we leave the Hamptons for a long time, we sometimes put the works in storage, just because I think if there's a pipe burst or something, I don't want to come back to devastation. And of course, the works are insured, but it's hard to leave. Our paintings are like children to us. It's hard to leave them alone for too long. But we don't tend to rotate so much. The stuff that's in LA, because LA is so far away, just stays. And then we'll probably actually start to rotate in the spring when I get a place in New York City again. We left the city during the pandemic to take a break. So at that point, I think things might rotate between the two places in New York. And then Austria is just like LA in so many ways. In fact, there's 3 or 4 works that are going to Austria, and I don't think they'll move just because art transport is so expensive, and you don't really get anything back from it. But the short story is not yet, but New York City and Hamptons, there probably will be rotating because it's more doable from a cost perspective.
Thank you, George. And then Destiny Fillmore had her hand up.
Yes, hi. Thank you again for spending the time with us. I've really enjoyed this talk. And I'm also from Florida, so it's good to see somebody else that's a Floridian or someone based in Florida. I'm curious to know if you're aware of any innovative projects or initiatives or I guess approaches to collection, exhibition, and also conservation for art. I'm really interested in spaces that are kind of critically thinking about the way that we deal with art generally. Are you aware of anything like that?
I mean, that's a very multi-pronged question. What are your interests in art? Like, where do you fall?
Okay, so I'm an art history major. I'm a senior at Spelman, and so I think one of my professional goals is to create a space that is sort of at the intersection between a museum and a gallery, and that offers essentially collectors a place to exhibit their work to the public. And so I'm just interested in knowing if there's anything that kind of presently exists that does that. I know that there are a few open collections or open storage areas, like the Brooklyn Museum, they have their storage that's accessible. And so I'm just curious to know if you know anybody doing anything cool.
I think the people that I look at, and there's a few things. So I think number one, I think important art belongs in institutions like Morehouse, like museums, and so I think that's where I'm most impressed is when people are acting as patrons and trying to pay it forward and make sure the art gets seen, right? I think that's number one. There's artists like MacArthur Binion, who started a foundation in Detroit called Modern Ancient Brown, and he's really mentoring and doing work with younger artists. And he's one of my favorite artists, and he's so important. And there is a exhibition component to the work that he's doing, but I think a lot of artists are pushing the forefront in that way. Mickalene Thomas at both the Baltimore Art Museum, where she has a current exhibition that's heavily draped in Black Lives Matter and inequality. She, both there and at the Bass Museum, where a show just closed in Miami, but that the last Art Basel Miami Beach, the exhibition opened in December of 2019. She also used emerging artists and artists that she really liked and respected. And so she wasn't just using her own art for the exhibitions. And I thought that was quite groundbreaking, because how many artists get offered museum shows and say, I want to show somebody else's work. But I think the opportunities are endless. And I'd love to have a separate follow-up conversation with you after this talk, at a coordinated time to talk more about it, because I think there's a lot of things and a lot of opportunities.
Okay.
Thank you, George. So we have one last question from Tennille Mack, and then there's also a question from Caleb Dixon in the chat if you would like to address that. Tennille, are you still with us?
Yes. Hi, my name is Tennille Mack. I'm currently a senior international studies and art history dual major, originally from Harlem. And my question is in regards to how you navigated a career in finance and sort of allowed a pivot into art, because I'm sort of teetering along the same path. And I wanted to know what advice you would have for anyone in their junior stages of their career.
So I think it kind of goes back to the beginning, where it's like you want to get the most prestigious job at the beginning of your career, so that you have that kind of branding and foundational experience, and then kind of broaden out and then do art, is kind of like how I serendipitously ended up there. But I think it's most important to do what you're most passionate about, to be honest, because the money comes later. If I completely obsessed over how much I was going to make for my whole career, I don't think I would have ended up as successful as I've been. So I really try to follow my own passions. My passion is numbers and business decisions kind of first. That's what I'm probably best at. But you also want to be realistic and pick the job that you're best at. So I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation with you, but I think with everything, the reason that all this opportunity came my way is I worked as hard at everything so that everyone that I worked with recommended me. So that's like the number one thing that you can do, no matter what the job is, no matter how prestigious it is. It's doing a really exceptional job on everything and treating everything like it's important. I think that also answers Caleb's question in a kind of roundabout way. It's like, follow your passion and do it better than anyone else, or do it as best you can. And I think from that kind of brings a lot of opportunity. And also for an entrepreneur, make sure that you're testing and talking to people and changing and morphing your idea. I think my idea for Wells Group in New York in 2009, when I was strategizing opening it, and my vision today changed, and it changed through conversation and being malleable to coming up with the best possible solution. Some entrepreneurs and most successful entrepreneurs are very insular, and they're trying to revolutionize the world in a way. And sometimes they don't ask the questions of the outside and sanity check it. And I think always sanity checking your idea, making sure it makes sense and iterating it is key to success, whether you're an artist, an entrepreneur, or a curator.
Thank you so much, George. Thank you also for just like wrapping us up with those questions, tying the two of them together. Masterful job. And as you said, you know, the key is to be good, not just good at what you do, but to be the best at what you do at all times. And that will always keep you moving in an upwards direction.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everyone. I missed the AUC, so it's great